left over from last week or that we didn't get to. I hope you all got my, I found a little thing about that, that mosaic of the donation of Constantine.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And I realized, you know, it's funny, I just assumed that the secular power would be the more prestigious thing, and then the church would be humbly receiving the donation, right? No. It's the church that's the power, and there's Constantine as sort of the supplicant offering the secular power to the church. So it really sort of turned my mind around on how the people who were illustrating it in the 14th century viewed, you know, what would have been going on. So that was really interesting.
Consider the source.
Exactly,
the church,
right? That's right. I mean, there were no photographers present. First of all, because the event never actually happened, but even if it had, there wouldn't have been. And so everybody's, you know, illustrating out of their own minds what that would have meant, what actually happened. So.
I thought we were
even if people, kings didn't feel the church was superior to them, they would generally depict it that way because they were political. They understood the politics of,
right. Well, and this illustration, of course, was in a church. So the church is always going to depict itself as being the, you know, the important one. And so that makes sense. So I wanted to go back and just talk a little bit about what were some of the qualities of Christianity that encouraged its spread and made it effective as a culture that became more and more popular. And if you are interested in that, The Triumph of Christianity by Bart Ehrman is very readable text about this particular era. And so I just want to share a couple of the things that he says about the early church that made it distinct from the kind of cultural religions that we've been talking about, the Roman Empire cult and the mystery cults and all the other alternatives, including Judaism, that were out there at the time of the Roman Empire. What set Christianity apart and made it attractive? And the first thing, which of course is a quality that we're so familiar with culturally that I think we have a hard time sometimes imagining the alternative, and that was its monotheism, that it really presented you with one specific God who was in charge of everything. And this was something that Judaism had been working out for a long time, you know, emerging in a culture that was henotheistic or polytheistic, that had lots of different gods. And it really was a process of centuries over which Judaism kind of evolved to the idea that no, there is only one God. It's not that we have the best God, it's that we have the only one that actually exists, and everybody else is a fake. And so Christianity really inherited that understanding of how the gods worked, and they used the tendency in the Roman culture to flatter whatever God you were worshiping at the moment by saying, "Oh, you are so powerful, you know, Jupiter, or you, whoever I'm worshiping, you're the best of them all." Now that kind of thing never assumes that the other ones don't exist. It just is a tribute to the one that you happen to be asking for something or praising at the moment. But Christianity took that idea as part of its message to the secular culture and said, you know how you're always looking for the high God, the most important God, the God who's in charge of everything. Well, we know who that is. You know, that's our God. This is who you're really talking about, even if you don't know it, kind of thing. So that identity of who's really in charge. You know, we are sure, we know for certain how that that cosmic structure works, and all of these other ways that you've been thinking about it, you can let go of that now, because now you have the answer. So that monotheism was appealing because it was more structured and less confusing. And then Christianity was evangelical in a way that really none of the other traditions were. I mean, Judaism had always had a very ambiguous notion about whether or not it was possible for someone who wasn't born Jewish to become Jewish, right? That was a sort of a vexed question. It was not automatic that could happen. So, and then the Roman civic cults just made the assumption that if you're a Roman citizen, you are naturally a worshiper of the Roman gods. There was you didn't have to achieve that. It came with the package at birth, kind of. So there was no need to invite people into that. And if you were not a Roman citizen, it was very complicated to achieve citizenship, but the religious part of that was the least important part. And whether or not you were formally a Roman citizen, you were certainly welcome to come worship the Roman gods. You know, there was nothing standing between you and participating in those cults if you wanted to. No one was going to check your ID, you know, at the temple door. You were certainly free to make sacrifices or offer prayers or whatever. Now, the mystery cults were a little different in that, no, you couldn't just show up to a Mithraeum and be part of the Mithras worship, or just show up to the illusion mysteries. You had to be an initiate. You know, you had to go through the levels of qualification and education and sort of credentialing, but anybody could do that. I mean, you had to be a man if it was Mithras, but you had to invest basically time and energy and probably financial resources as well into becoming a higher level initiate in the cult. But you wanted that to be exclusive. You know, you didn't want every other Tom, Dick, and Harry to have what you had, because you had worked for it, right? You had achieved something by doing this. So you weren't going out saying to all your friends and neighbors, oh, come on over with me to the next sacrifice or the next ritual. That, you know, you were like guarding those secrets because they were hard earned. So Christianity was really kind of unique in the fact that if once you bought the package, once you owned those stories as your own, you wanted to pass them on to your family and your friends and neighbors and so on. So it was part of the nature of being a Christian that you were sharing that good news, that gospel, with the people that you knew in a fairly organic social way. And that was not something that any of the other religions at the time were doing. Another thing about Christianity was that it was exclusive. So you could only be a Christian or not. You couldn't be This was a big struggle. You could not be a Christian and still be a worshiper of Zoroaster. You could not be a Christian and still make sacrifices to the emperor. If you were going to be a Christian, that had to be it. That was the only thing. And so that required you to no longer be whatever it was that you had sort of been by heredity or by choice before. And that meant that every time someone became a Christian, there was one less, what we now call pagan, out there. Whereas if you suddenly decided, oh, today I'm going to go worship Minerva, that didn't mean you were no longer a worshiper of Zeus. You know, it didn't mean you therefore weren't something else. But when you became a Christian, you were then not anything else. And so that created a tipping point where eventually there were enough Christians that there were fewer pagans. And that begins to shift the balance of power in a way that none of the other accumulative kinds of religious options had done to one another before that. Also, Christianity was identity forming. So if you were going around the Roman world, you might say, you know, I'm a Roman citizen. You might say, I was born in Carthage. You might say different kinds of things about your identity, but religion was very seldom one of them. You wouldn't even necessarily say, you know, I'm a practitioner of Zoroastrianism, or I'm a worshiper of Isis. That wasn't an important descriptor of what made you who you were, because it didn't tell anybody anything about what else you were not. But if you said, I'm a Christian, that was claiming an identity. That did tell other people something about both who you were and who you were not. So it was actually the Christians who kind of invented the term pagan as a way of identifying non-Christian believers. There really was no collective term for that before the Christians came along, because there wasn't anything over against it to be identified as. So pagan really just originally meant someone who doesn't live in the city, someone who dwells out in the countryside. And because Christianity spread more easily in the cities, it was kind of an urban phenomenon. Christians began talking about, oh, those hicks, you know, out in the countryside that haven't heard, you know, the news about Christianity. And that's how anybody who wasn't a Christian became identified as a pagan, in much the way that the Jews had used the term Gentile, that anybody who wasn't a Jew was identified as a Gentile, just meant non-Jew. But in Judaism, certainly that was also an identity, that if you identified yourself as a Jew, that told people something about you. But Christianity was something that you chose. Judaism was something you inherited. So there was kind of a difference there. And Christianity had certain belief kinds of attractions, some of which were, first of all, it had a specific account about immortality. It offered the believer a way to overcome death and to make sure that their immortality would be happy. So there were some traditions that had some ideas about immortality, but it was kind of a chancy thing. If you look at some of the people or semi-divine characters that are made immortal in, for instance, the Roman pantheon, you know, you can end up as Sisyphus, you know, pushing a rock up the hill for eternity, or you can end up like Prometheus, you know, chained to the rock with the vulture eating your liver for eternity. So that wasn't necessarily a good thing. You know, becoming immortal could be good news or bad news. But in Christianity, not only did you have the option of becoming immortal, but if you chose properly, you could be assured that the immortality would be happy. And that was something that not a lot of the other cults either offered you immortality at all, other than the sort of collective immortality like Judaism. But even if you could get there, there wasn't always a way of controlling what the quality of that life would be. So Christianity offered you safety within your immortality as well as immortality. They also offered what were identified as miracles, or what the Jewish tradition had always called signs. You know, that there were specific things that could happen in your life or someone else's life that you might hear about that were evidence of the power and presence of the Christian God. So healing, of course, I mean, if you look at the stories about Jesus's ministry, that's a big one, that people are forever coming to him with either mental or organic diseases, and he's able to heal them. But other kinds of signs that would happen in people's lives that they would take as an indication of the power of the Christian God in their life. So, you know, you might say, oh, I was never able to bear a live child, and then my family became Christian, and now I have a healthy son. Or, you know, this person in our family struggled with what today we would call alcoholism or addiction, and then they became a Christian and now they don't do that anymore. Or, you know, things that we would identify as logically explainable happenings, but in the life of a believer, they became regarded as signs or regarded as miracles. Or just, you know, there was a big fire in our city, but our house didn't burn down. So that was a sign of God's favor to us. And Christianity claimed those signs. You know, this is evidence that our God is at work in the world. Christianity also offered, which not a lot of other traditions did, a narrative framework for future history. So you get a little bit of this with the Zoroastrians, where they have the idea that the universe is a struggle between the power of good and the power of evil, and it depends on which side you come down on who's going to triumph. But there's not much of a time frame attached to that. You know, it's going to happen sometime in the future out there. But most of the normal cults of the time were like, okay, we're going to make a sacrifice so that this year we get a good harvest, or we're going to make a sacrifice so that this voyage that we're about to take will be successful, or whatever. In that current moment, you were in relationship with the gods about how things were going to turn out. But there was no sense that a year from now, or 10 years from now, or 100 years from now, anything was going to be any different from how it is now. And, you know, the next voyage that you take, you're going to have to make another set of sacrifices. And the whole process is going to be to do over tomorrow or next season or next year or whatever. Christianity had this conviction that the world is a mess and God is about to come and straighten it out. And when that happens, we Christians will turn out to be on the right side of history, you know, and everything will be different after that. So that sense of, we know what's about to happen. We know what's coming down the road at us, which not a lot of other groups had something like that to offer. So it's almost like being part of a conspiracy theory group. You know, we understand what's going on in the world in a way that nobody else does. You know, that sense of, I'm in the know and you're not. So Christianity offered that. They also offered an ethical God. And again, we take that so for granted in our culture that it's hard sometimes to think about what would it be like to have a God who wasn't ethical? But most of the Greek and Roman gods, and even like Isis and Mithras and some of those characters, that first of all, they have extremely fragile egos. They need to be placated all the time. But they run around, they come to Earth, they have affairs, they get mad, they punish people for no reason. That there's not that inherent ethical quality that Christianity brings. And even if you think back to Judaism, there was kind of an ongoing argument between the people who said, you know, Yahweh is going to punish the people who do what he said, punish the people who don't do what he says, and reward the people who do what he says, even if what he says is to kill all the men and rape all the women and, you know, steal all the cattle for your own. You know, there's no sense that even Yahweh is bound in his own behavior by ethical constraints. So Christianity was kind of proposing a new concept of a God who is only righteous, who is only the enforcement power of an ethical life, and is himself an ethical character. You know, he's not taking the form of a bull and coming and having sex with Europa, or you know, throwing out golden apples to cheat in a foot race, or, you know, all those kind of very interesting, intriguing mythologies that other gods and goddesses had going on. But people could look at them and evaluate them and say, oh, that's God is cheating. You know, that God is doing something that you wouldn't approve of if human beings did it. And Christianity offered a God who didn't do anything like that. And that was a fairly unique force. And then finally, Christianity offered an enforced community and enforced charity. So whereas you could go to the temple of Artemis, let's say, and offer a sacrifice, and that wouldn't, you know, that would be great, and you might meet someone you knew there, or you might not. Go away. Come on. There was no assumption that when you went to participate in that ritual, there would necessarily be anybody there that you knew, or that you would ever see again, necessarily. So there was no sense that because you and I both participated in that cult, we therefore have a connection. Now, in the mystery traditions, where you might be part of a small group of the folks who were going through the initiation levels together, or something like that, but that was very exclusive. It wasn't inclusive of the people who were participants. You wanted to become better than all the folks who were in the low levels below you. So whereas Christianity, the major ritual was coming together for a meal, and the assumption that in that process you would make personal connections with the other participants, and you would see them again the following week and again the following week. So, you know, our vision of what church probably means goes back to that, and that was pretty innovative on the part of the Christians. And then also out of those connections would arise some powers of mutual care. So if you were, you know, a young mother with 3 kids, and all of a sudden your husband is killed in the army or whatever, you're not necessarily out starving on the streets. If you're part of a Christian community, there's a sense that we as a group have a responsibility to help you in that position. Or if you're suddenly sick and you can't work, there's some expectation that the community has resources that are going to be available to you in that kind of emergency. And that really didn't happen in other religious kinds of structures. So all of those things were part of what made Christianity different and attractive to folks who were considering it as an option, shall we say. Does that make sense? Anybody have questions or thoughts? Okay. So there's this period between about, say, 100, 110, 120 into the Common Era. That's kind of the apostolic period when the texts that will ultimately become the New Testament are being written. And then there's sort of the start of the Constantine and his advocacy for Christianity that starts about 310, 313 in there. So there's 200 years sort of in the middle there, in which that during the first part of that, you get a very slow, and Ehrman talks about how it's exponential, that Christianity spreads through word of mouth, through people talking to each other. And so it's kind of a curve. It starts out pretty slow and low key, and then it begins to climb by the multiplicative process of people communicating with each other. So it's really under the radar, not because it's oppressed or because people are necessarily hiding in that first 100 years or so, but just because it's not big enough to make much difference to anybody except the participants themselves. And then when you get to about 200, you start hearing these official notices from various places throughout the empire of like governors writing into the emperor and saying, now, what should we do about the Christians? And in most cases, the answer was, nothing really. And for a certain period of time, they get classified with the Jews. It's like, okay, the Christians and the Jews, we know them. They're not gonna worship the emperor, but they're really not gonna make trouble, so just leave them alone. Or you would get sporadic, very local kinds of persecutions where the governor would say to a bunch of people, are you really Christians? And sometimes they would say, yes, but we'll worship the emperor anyway. And sometimes they would say, well, no, not really, if you're going to make a thing about it. And sometimes they would say, yes, and what are you going to do about it? And so in those cases, sometimes the governor would say, I really wish you'd reconsider. And then if they wouldn't, he'd have them exiled or have them killed, or in a lot of cases, strip them of their property, which may have been part of the point of it in the first place. In some cases, he'd just say, well, okay, then get out of here. I don't want anything to do with you. But it wasn't really systematic until you get to about 250, 249 to be exact, and the Emperor Decius. And Decius was facing kind of a critical situation in the empire, which is to say there was an economic crisis and there were some military defeats and there were some bad harvests. So he was under a lot of pressure. And his solution to that was to say, we think this is happening because the gods of Rome are being ignored. Or clearly the gods of Rome are mad at us for some reason. And so we're going to try to figure out why that is. So Decius was the first emperor to issue an edict that everybody everywhere in the empire had to offer sacrifices on behalf of the emperor and the empire, but to the gods of Rome. Those were the ones he wanted to get on the right side of, right? They were the ones who were causing the crisis. And so what that meant was that all citizens were required to participate in those sacrifices. And they had to get, it was interesting, it was almost like paying your taxes. You had to get a certificate, a written certificate from the temple, from the local officials that said, yes, you had showed up and you had made your sacrifice and you had eaten part of the feast, and you know, that you were a loyal Roman citizen. It makes me think a little bit about McCarthy and the, you know, the Red Scare, that you needed to have certified that you were a loyal citizen, you know. So this was a problem for many Christians. Some of them bought the certificates. You know, you could bribe an official to get them without actually doing the thing. Some of them just went into hiding so that they couldn't be found and questioned about it. And some of them showed up and openly refused to do it. And a handful of them were executed for that if they were really obnoxious about it. But again, by far the most common sanction for that was to be deprived of your property. So it was in some ways a fundraising effort for the state, you know, that if you refuse to participate in this process of assuring the favor of the gods, then they were going to take away whatever property you had. And that, of course, created a lot of hardship for the people to whom it happened, but it was a bureaucratic kind of solution to the issue under Decius. So the first actual attempt by the empire authorities in Rome to actually exterminate Christianity itself doesn't happen until 303. And if you think that Constantine is going to come along in 313 and issue the Edict of Milan, which is basically religious toleration, there's really only a 10-year period in there that is actual intentional persecution exclusively of Christianity as an empire-wide policy. You know, so that 200 years is not 200 years of unremitting persecution of Christians and throwing everybody to the lions, right? It's really a very short, and particularly in the West, because this happens under Diocletian, and Diocletian is the emperor of the whole Roman Empire, but it's his deputies in the eastern portion, in the Constantinople and East, that are gung-ho for this, that are supporting this oppression. And so they are going to continue it even after Diocletian himself dies in 306. So it's basically 3 years, from 303 to 306, that Diocletian himself, under pressure from his underlings in the East, is doing this empire-wide persecution of Christians. As soon as he's dead, the folks in the West quit. They're just like, okay, we don't have to do that anymore. So it's even a shorter period in Rome and the Western parts of the empire. But even in the East, by the time Constantine takes charge in 312 to 313, he is going to kick out the two deputies who were really in favor of this and carrying it out. It's also important to notice that in many cases, if you were a Roman citizen and you were condemned for something in one of the territories, you could basically appeal to Rome. And what that meant was you had to be sent to Rome, and your case had to be judged there by the Senate or by the emperor's court. And if you were condemned, then that sentence would be carried out in Rome. So a lot of times what would happen is the local governor or the local authorities would kind of kick it upstairs And they'd say, oh, okay, this guy's a Roman citizen. We're going to send him to Rome to be judged by the emperor. And so that's why you have the image of all of these Christians, you know, in the Colosseum with the lions, that sort of cultural trope that we all know, because that tended to happen in Rome, no matter where you were from. If you were really going to be executed like that, it was generally after you'd been sent to Rome. And there were Christians, not huge numbers of them, but a handful who really wanted that. They wanted martyrdom. They wanted to prove their loyalty. And so we do have letters that some of them wrote to the Christians in Rome, because of course, once you got to Rome, then your fellow Christians could use their personal connections and their political power and whatever resources they have to try to get you freed. And so if someone was really looking for martyrdom, they would write to the Christian church in Rome and say, hey, stay away from me. You know, don't interfere. Don't try to rescue me, because this is my aspiration. I want to die as a martyr and prove my faith in Christ. And we have some of those letters because they were saved by the church in Rome to demonstrate that, first of all, that they would have helped if they could have, but also to exemplify the strength of the faith of these people who came and became martyrs. So I just want to kind of frame that historical context, because the records that we have, which of course are the ones that were preserved by the Christians or recalled much later, even centuries later, by Christians about what went on at this time, makes it sound like that whole period was kind of one unrelenting persecution, you know, starting with Nero in 64 and not ending until Constantine in 313. And that's really not the case at all. Does that seem clear? Okay, I'm seeing a few nods. Yes, okay. That was a yes, Jim, and not a comment? Okay, all right, cool. So as you may remember from last time, we talked a little bit about how when Constantine came to the throne after the death of his father in 313, he was in charge of, initially he was in charge of the West. He had to fight with the other guy who was supposed to be his sort of partner in the West, and Constantine defeated him, so he became the exclusive governor in the West. And then he teamed up with the guy from the East, whose name I'd have to look up. It starts with an L. And together they issued this Edict of Milan. They met in Milan, and they issued this edict that said, okay, everybody stop persecuting everybody, is basically what they said. We are not in favor of any religious persecution by anybody, of anybody. What we want in our realm is peace and unity. And that was Constantine's deal. All he ever wanted was for everybody to get along and not cause trouble. That was his whole goal throughout his administration. And everything that he did with Christianity was in the service of that goal. And you may remember that before he has his vision and before he becomes a worshiper of Jesus, he's a worshiper of Sol Invictus, who's the sun god, who's one of the ways in which people envision the high god of the Roman pantheon, right? He's the one who's in charge of everybody else in the system of gods. And so, you know, if you want, you can worship Hera, but Hera's just going to have to go and ask Sol Invictus anyway. So why not go straight to the source, right? Why not be a devotee of Sol Invictus? And Sol Invictus had some similarities to the cult of Mithras. And so those were the two most popular religious persuasions within the armies. The soldiers tended to be either followers of Mithras or followers of Sol Invictus, because they were in it for the power. You know, they were in it for the be our champion in battle, right? They wanted a god of armies, because that's what they were about. So Constantine was always looking for the advantage that would help to unite his followers. He wanted his followers to all be on the same page. So if worshiping Sol Invictus was a good way to, you know, bring the armies together and get them all cooperating, then that was fine. If, you know, if Sol Invictus said, which is what happened in Constantine's vision, Sol Invictus said to him, here, paint this sign of the Christian God, the Christian hero, I guess you'd say, the Cairo, paint that on your shields and then you'll win the battle. So he did, and he did. And so that God must have some something going on, right? He must have some power. And so gradually then, between 13 and 24, or the early 20s, when he's, or the early 30s, sorry, the early 30s, when he starts to envision building this new city, right? Constantine is going to build a new capital, and he's going to name it after himself. And it's going to be a city that doesn't have any pagan temples. It doesn't have any pre-existing religious commitments. And he is going to build a church there. It's going to be dedicated to Jesus and the Christian God. Now, this should ring a little bell when we think about David building the capital of Jerusalem, right? In the Jewish nation, he's trying to create a balance of power between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So rather than picking a capital in one of those places that already exists and people already have feelings about and loyalties about, no, he's going to pick this really out of the way, half-baked little city and make it his capital and build his temple there and create something new, basically out of whole cloth, so that it can be what he wants it to be. And that's essentially what Constantine is doing in about 330 when he starts construction on Constantinople. He wants a new capital for the empire where there are no, it's not already dedicated to Jupiter. It's not already dedicated to somebody else. And he can make it what he wants it to be, which is this unified place with one religious commitment that he's basically going to be in charge of. Is that still tracking, everybody? Okay, all right. So Constantine is going to immediately start having trouble within this new tradition. It's like he thought he had this Christian thing where everybody was agreed about it. Well, it turns out, no, they're not. And the first thing that's going to happen is he gets a complaint from a bunch of people in North Africa, a bunch of people in Carthage. And they want to say to him, hey, emperor, since you seem to be in charge of this whole thing now, we need a new bishop here in Carthage. And we want you to tell the old bishop to get out because we don't want him anymore. And the reason we don't want him anymore is because he is one of the people who, in the persecutions under Diocletian, ratted us out. And the way that he ratted us out was, one of the things that Diocletian said was that the Christians were not to be allowed to meet, and if they had any special buildings that they used for meeting, those were to be torn down. but mostly they were meeting in private homes, so that didn't affect them that much. But the other thing was that all the copies of their scriptures were to be collected and burned. And this is way more threatening in a society where you don't have a printing press, where every copy that you have of everything has been laboriously copied out by hand, and that's an expensive thing to do. And if you get your hands on a lot of that, you can really destroy the intellectual heritage and the history of a community. So what Diocletian did was he instructed the local authorities to collect all the copies of the Christian scriptures that they could get their hands on. And where did they go to look for those copies of the Christian scriptures, but to the people who were known authorities in the churches? So if you were a priest, and particularly if you were a bishop, the Roman guards showed up on your doorstep and said, hand over your scriptures. And the word Bible really wasn't current at that time, but you know, if you have copies of letters from Paul, if you have copies of Gospels, give them here. And some of the bishops, in fear of their lives or for their families or whatever, they did. They handed over the scriptures, and those scriptures were destroyed. And so after Constantine came to power and there was no more threat, people were pissed at the bishops who had handed over the scriptures. And they were called traditores, the people who handed stuff over. So then people were, the members of the church and the lower level leaders were like, we don't think you're a good Christian. We don't respect your authority. And not only that, we don't respect your authority retroactively. So we question whether the people who were baptized by you long ago are really baptized. Does that really count, or do they need to be baptized again? We really question whether the priests who were ordained by you, and particularly any other bishops that you ordained in your authority as bishop, we question whether they are really bishops or really priests, and do the baptisms that they do really count. So you see, it's a two-level thing. It's not necessarily the priest who baptized me, maybe he didn't do anything wrong, but if he was made a priest by one of these guys who was co-opted, who was complicit, then his being a priest doesn't count, which then means maybe my baptism doesn't count. And this was a question for a lot of communities, because a lot of communities this had happened in to some degree or another. But particularly for this outfit in Carthage, because they didn't like their bishop to begin with. They really wanted rid of him. And he was a defender of the bishop who had ordained him. And the bishop who had ordained him as a bishop was clearly someone who had, in fact, turned over scriptures to the Romans during that persecution. So does everybody see what's going on here, what the issue is? Now, I don't know really anything about this particular bishop in Carthage. I mean, maybe he was really a no-goodnik and they were right to want to get rid of him. They certainly felt strongly about it, let's put it that way. So what they did was they appealed to Constantine, and they said, well, since you have lifted this persecution, since you say we're not doing this anymore, we now want you to get rid of this bishop for us, because we don't think he's qualified. We think he's not a legitimate bishop. So what does Constantine do? It's interesting. He says, I'm not a religious authority. What do I know about this? So the first thing he does is he goes to his local bishop, the Bishop of Rome, and he says, tell me what to do about this. And this is part of the beginning of the accretion of authority, especially to the Bishop of Rome, who ultimately will become the Pope. That office will become the the highest office in the church. At the moment, it's not. At the moment, it's just we got bunches of bishops and they're all equal to each other. Fine. But Constantine consults the Bishop of Rome because he's the one who's handy, right? And the Bishop of Rome says, no, that's not true. His ordination is perfectly good because the power of God is the power of God, and it doesn't matter by whose hand it was done. Doesn't matter whether or not you feel that the human being was qualified to do this. The point is that God shows up and does it, and God doesn't care, so it's fine, the bishop tells Constantine. So Constantine writes back to this group and says, no, never mind, you're fine. Your bishop is your bishop, and be happy. Well, they're not happy. So they write back and they say, no, really, we think this guy doesn't qualify. You know, you need to do something about this. So Constantine is like, oh, okay, you know what? We'll get a group together. We'll call together a whole conference of bishops. And so he does that in 313 or 314. 314. And he puts the question to this whole group of bishops. Now think about it. If you're a bishop, do you want the qualification of your authority to be something that can be called into question by something that the guy who ordained you might yet do? Of course you don't. I mean, there's no other answer that a group of bishops is going to come up with other than that. No, once you're a bishop, you're always a bishop. It's the power of God. It's not who ordained you. So Constantine sends back the same answer once again. And the guy who was in charge of this group is named Donatus. And that's why it's called the Donatist controversy. And says, no, your bishop is your bishop, be happy. And they complain again. You know, they're still not happy with this decision. And Constantine basically says, look, it's not my problem. I've given you two answers. You don't like them. You go figure it out. But I'm not going to play this game anymore. Because again, all Constantine wants is for everybody to calm down and be happy and be unified as one empire, right? So that is his first almost immediate experience. You know, as soon as the Edict of Milan gets issued, he gets this complaint from the Donatists in Carthage. But now he has a pattern for what to do when he is appealed to as the emperor to resolve these kinds of disputes. And he really does think it's his job to do that, right? I mean, because the empire cult has always seen the current emperor as its highest authority, you know, its decision maker. How are we going to worship the gods of Rome and preserve the civic safety and integrity of the empire? Well, the emperor is going to tell us how to do that because that's his job, right? So Constantine actually feels like, okay, I guess this is my job. If people are writing to me telling me, you know, that they have these problems, I guess I better figure out how to solve it. And if you think about it, that puts the whole donation of Constantine idea in a little different light. That basically Constantine would have been saying to the church, look, you know, you deal with this stuff. You want the authority, take the authority. I am out of this. You know, you're the ones who have God on your side. You know, you're the ones who have the wisdom. Quit putting me in this position that I'm not qualified for. So that actually makes it a little more plausible that he might have, out of frustration, done something like that. But it's the next controversy that that Constantine is going to get involved in, that is the one that really is part of our history as Unitarians, and that is really kind of inaugurates the next era in the history of the Christian church and creates its its hierarchical structure that it's going to continue to evolve for the next 1,000 years or so. And that is the Nicene controversy. So once again, let me pause there and see if there's anything that anybody wants to clarify or comment on. Did everybody get your notes for today? You might want to turn to those because I think it might be helpful. That it gets, the theology of this gets a little obscure, but it may be helpful if we see some familiar language that's going to be invoked. So the second page of your notes is a segment from the first chapter of the Gospel of John. And remember now, we are not yet at 364, which is when we first get an enumeration of which items are part of the New Testament that actually corresponds to our New Testament of today. So this is still a very free form kind of floating, you know, what letters do you happen to have? What gospels do you happen to have? What other books of guidance do you as a church happen to have? And Ehrman did some interesting calculations about the average size of a church community, a Christian church community at that time, and the percentage of literacy. And so his calculation is that on the average, you might have had 2 or 3 literate people in a church of about 150 people. So that those people, the literate ones, would have been recognized as the authorities. You know, they would have been the bishop and the priest and the deacon or whatever. And really, part of their job would have been to read these letters and these scriptures and these announcements and anything that was to be communicated from either the hierarchy of the government about the church or from the hierarchy of the church. You know, you would have had to have one of a handful of people in the congregation read it to everybody else. It wouldn't have been something that most people were reading for themselves. Which I think means that the whole idea of announcements in church goes back a really long way, because that's what they would have done. So the Arian controversy, or the Nicene controversy, kind of begins with this fellow named Origen. And Origen of Alexandria, oh, and I just wanted to point out, practically all of these people are from or connected with Alexandria. This is one of the 5 cities in the Pentarchy. It's one of the 5 bishops who come to be sort of the governing council for Christianity. And we've seen, you know, we know why Rome is in that mix. We know why Jerusalem is in that mix. We know why Constantinople is in that mix. The other 2 are Antioch and Alexandria. So this is a little hint of why Alexandria is in that mix, because it was kind of an intellectual center, and a lot of the early writings about Christian philosophy and Christian orthodoxy come out of the schools in Alexandria. Does that make sense, everybody? So another thing that's kind of fascinating about this is probably pretty much everybody has heard about Arius, right? Arius is one of the participants in this Arian controversy, and he is our spiritual ancestor. He's the guy who says, no, Jesus is not exactly God. So he's a proto-Unitarian is what we should properly call him. And the other, his opponent, the person who generates the arguments against him, is a guy named Athanasius. So it's Arius of Alexandria and Athanasius of Alexandria. And wouldn't you know that the bishop of Alexandria is named Alexander? So he's Alexander of Alexandria, which is really not helpful. But both Arius and Athanasius are not themselves bishops. They're not actually qualified to be part of this council of bishops. They're sort of adjuncts in this whole process, but they're the ones who are remembered, which I think is kind of fun. Anyway, going back to Origen. Origen's earlier than this controversy, because the controversy is going to come to a head in 325. Obviously, it's been brewing for a lot longer than that, but the council's actually going to be called. It's actually going to happen in 325. It was probably called, who knows how much earlier than that, but years. It takes years to bring that kind of a group together. So Origen is a writer who begins to try to systematize a philosophical underpinning for Paul's Christianity. All right, and remember we have the Jerusalem Christians who were really a sect of Judaism who thought the Messiah had come. We have the Galilean Christians who thought of Jesus as kind of a guru, a community leader. And both of those groups have faded into obscurity pretty much by this point. So what we're left with is Pauline Christianity, which is more about how does Jesus function in the cosmic structure of the universe than it is about anything about what Jesus taught or did while he lived. Everybody remember that? Is that ringing a bell? Hopefully, okay, good. So Paul is teaching this idea about the new birth, the new being, that you can become, instead of being just a flesh person who's gonna die, you can be born again as a spiritual person who's gonna live forever. That's Paul's big deal. But he has some thought about, well, it's because Jesus is connected with God and is able to help bring about God's kingdom, that therefore we get to participate in that. But Paul was not a systematic thinker. Paul doesn't ever really sit down and explain exactly how this all works. He's too busy making converts. He's too busy trying to urge people to get their ticket on this train, right? So Origen is one of the first people who says, okay, let's write this down and think about how this all works. And so he is going to go to the Gospel of John. And that's why I gave you this first part here. Does anybody have that in front of you? Want to read for us so I can rest my voice for a minute? Got it, Kate? Oh, all right. Whoever.
Go ahead, Kay.
Okay, go ahead. Just read us that segment from the Gospel of John, and everybody try to get that language in your ear.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
All right, hang on for 1 second. So when you hear word, especially when it's capitalized like that, think logos. Okay, that's the Greek term that means word or truth or way, or it's a very expansive term for sort of the order of things. If anybody has any familiarity with Taoism, it's a lot like the Tao, the way things are and the way they ought to be, that kind of sense. So it's not just the spoken word, although it is the spoken word, but it's also all of the philosophical underpinning of that. Okay, thank you, Kay. Go ahead.
The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Sorry, page 2. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe.
This is John the Baptist we're talking about now.
Aha. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe in his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God.
So let me point out right here that when John says he came unto his own, but his own received him not, who's he talking about there?
The Jews.
The Jews, right? Exactly. But as many as received him, so that then it went out to the Gentiles, and they're the ones that picked up on it, right? And so they're the ones that got the power to become the sons of God. Okay, go ahead, Kay.
And the word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, and the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bare witness of him and cried, saying, This was he of whom I spake. He hath cometh after me and preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness have not we all received, and grace for grace? For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. No man hath seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him.
Okay. So that, as we may remember, this sounds a little different from the sort of narrative voice that's in the synoptic gospels, right? So Jesus said this, that, and the other thing, and then he went here and he did this and that. This is much more of a sort of philosophical thing, which begins by equating Jesus with the Logos, right? So the Word, the way, the truth was with God and was God. And by the way, that's the same thing as Jesus. And that's what Origen is going to pick up on. And that's what Athanasius and Arius are going to be arguing about, is what we mean by all of that. Okay, everybody with me here? Okay, so Origen, in his sort of academic explication of how Christianity works, is going to point out that, okay, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is equal to the Logos, the truth, or the order, the structure of the universe, all those things. Jesus is that. And that is co-eternal with God the Father. So that God cannot exist without the necessary essence of the universe, the way the universe has to be. There's an idea, if you will, or a truth that underpins all existence. And that thing has to be just as old as God, Origen says. And that thing is also what constitutes Jesus. So he is creating a little bit of ambiguity, and that's what is going to trouble Arius and Athanasius. So Arius is going to come along a generation later and say that the Logos is something that comes forth from God, just as a son comes forth from a parent. And that it can't be co-eternal, that God had to exist and then sort of summon up and bring forth the Logos. He had to let the Logos be manifested in order to be able to create the universe according to those laws. So it was something that he had to exist in order for that to form in his mind and then be made real in creation. And so therefore, God existed before the Logos existed, which means he existed before Jesus existed. And we talk about Jesus as being his only begotten son. That's in the scriptures too. Well, if God was going to beget his son, then he had to exist before his son was begotten, right? I mean, that seems reasonable, right? And so therefore, it cannot be that Jesus and or the Logos are exactly the same age as God, that they were in existence the split nanosecond that God was in existence. No, God had to come into existence and then bring them forth and then create the universe. So therefore, Jesus is subordinate to the Father, and they cannot be the same exact thing. All right, that's Arius. And then Athanasius is going to come along and say, no, Jesus is of the same essence as God the Father, that there is no difference between God and the Logos. They're the same thing. So the minute God was in existence, the Logos had to be in existence, and therefore Jesus had to be in existence. And they have always existed. There was no moment in which God brought forth Jesus. Jesus was always part of the deal from the very first beginning, right? And so, as you might imagine, here's the seed of the idea of the Trinity, right? This is the argument that's going to get resolved by the idea of the Trinity, but not before it's been the subject of a very great deal of debate. And remember, this is before any of the creeds. This is before any of the writings of people like Augustine. You know, this is before all of the authority that we have experienced from centuries of sort of church tradition. None of that was out there. Everything was up for grabs. So everyone was sort of trying to understand it as best they could, and then teach other people to understand it the way they understood it. And so these questions were of significance. They were like, well, what are we, how do we understand Paul? What are we supposed to think about Jesus? Much later on at the time of the Reformation, this will come back around in the question, which is a good question. Is it or is it not legitimate to pray to Jesus? All right, the Catholic Church will have answered that question for centuries as, oh yeah, you know, you can pray to Jesus, you can pray to Mary, you can pray to the saints, you can pray to lots of people. Roman Catholics were promiscuous in their prayers. But one of the things the Protestants are going to argue, and particularly the Unitarians, is that no, it is not appropriate to pray to anybody but God. God is it. And that kind of goes back to the Sol Invictus idea of, you know, why are you going to pester all these minor gods who are just going to have to refer everything up the chain of command anyway and end up at the highest God, Sol Invictus or whoever that is. And so the Protestants are going to say it is not appropriate. Jesus is not God, and therefore you don't pray to anyone but God, and therefore you don't pray to Jesus. Well, that is really flying in the face of a whole lot of Christian history and liturgy and art, and all kinds of things are thrown into a cocked hat. Yeah, Peggy.
But Christians don't Protestants still believe in the Trinity though?
They do.
Does the Trinity say that Jesus is God?
Right.
So
right. So the The technical term is non-adorantists, those who do not adore. They won the argument about Mary and the saints, but they lost the argument about Jesus, is basically what happened at the time of the Reformation.
So they just went ahead and accepted that Jesus is God anyway.
Right, that's right. So if you keep the Trinity, and at the time of the Reformation, the Trinity was one of the things that was on the auction block, are we going to keep this or not? They just, partly because Michael Servetus was so irritating, they decided, yes, they were going to keep it. And so then it remains appropriate to pray to Jesus and the Holy Spirit and God, but nobody else. All the rest of that Catholic pantheon of saints and Mary and all that, those are gone. And you see that in Protestant liturgy. Whereas you still have Catholics still do the rosary and, other rituals that have that, those other objects of prayer besides Jesus and God. So go ahead.
If as you described it, Jesus was, according to some, Jesus was always there.
Uh-huh.
But then what is the nativity? What is the idea of, is that just a changing form of something that already existed?
See, this is exactly the sort of question that people were asking, right? So, and there were a lot of proposed answers to that question that came to be identified as heretical, that is to say, not Orthodox Christianity. So there were some people who said, okay, at the moment Jesus was born, he laid aside his divinity and he became fully human at that point. So he could not have commanded the seas to be still by himself. God the Father had to be looking down and doing that through him as a sign, of his approval or his, yes, listen to this guy. Other people suggested, well, that when Jesus was born, that was one facet of God. That it's like God turned around, and when he turned around a little bit, then he looked like Jesus as a baby. That all of those and he turned around a little bit more on the day of Pentecost, and then he looked like tongues of fire. And so, depending on which aspect of God you're looking at, he looks like these different things. That also was declared to be heretical. Then there was the idea that, well, you think you're looking at a real human baby, but it's really kind of a hologram that's really all God. There never was an actual physical presence. It was all an illusion that God made up to get people to listen to him, kind of. So there, on the one hand, there was the idea, all human, no God, all God, no human, God pretending, but, there were all kinds of ways of understanding what happened at that moment of incarnation. And if you listen carefully to some of our Christmas carols, you can hear that argument in the background. What's going on with this baby in the manger? Mild he lays his glory by. That's the idea that God gives up his godness to come and be a baby in the manger. That I'll come up with some other examples, but I mean, that argument never goes away. It just gets translated into musical terms, but that's exactly the question of what's going on here. The Orthodox answer would be that Jesus always existed with God in heaven, but there is that moment in history when he is manifested both fully human and fully divine, in this baby in the manger, which in my view sort of kicks the can down the road, doesn't really answer the question. But that's what they ultimately came up with, is that it's 100% both. which is a mystery, you know. It's because the Trinity really, it's very hard to make rational sense. But that's the argument. So and the idea is that God is not absent from heaven. There was another theory that for that 33 years, God was missing. God was AWOL in heaven because he was busy down here, you know, doing this thing. No. God's in heaven that whole time. He's not gone. So you just kind of have to wrap your mind around something that doesn't make a lot of logical sense. And that's actually what Arius was saying. It doesn't make logical sense. If Jesus is the Son of God, which all the scriptures say, and if the Logos proceeds from God and Jesus is equal to the Logos, then there has to be that process by which God produces the Logos and Jesus, and therefore Jesus is subordinate. So this, and as I pointed out, Arius is a presbyter, which is a lesser level of clerical function, and Athanasius is a deacon, which is also a lesser level of clerical function. So neither one of them is a bishop at the time that this argument gets elevated, but Arius was writing commentary about Origen's writings. That's how this issue came up. He was writing about a predecessor in Alexandria. So Arius is a presbyter in Alexandria. He's writing about his intellectual forebear, if you will, Origen of Alexandria. And that the then bishop of Alexandria, who's named Alexander, doesn't agree with him. He really doesn't, thinks he's in error, but also doesn't like him. And so the reason that Arius is still a presbyter is that Alexander, Bishop Alexander, refuses to allow him to be ordained as a priest because he doesn't like him and he thinks he's a heretic, and it's his seat, you know, it's his city, it's his authority. And so part of what happens is that Arius goes off to travel, which people who were serious scholars often did, because the only way to read other texts sometimes is to go where those other texts were, if you didn't happen to have a copy in your library in Alexandria, which was one of the most complete libraries in the world. But he also wanted to get out of Dodge, I think, because he had such a hostile relationship with Alexander. So he goes traveling, and he has some friends, colleagues in the church in other areas, and while he's traveling, one of them ordains him as a priest. And he comes back to Alexander and says, you know, I'm a priest anyway. And we have some of the correspondence. I mean, Alexander fires off these furious letters to this other bishop and the other people he thinks participated in flouting his authority, you know, over this guy who's supposed to be under him. So this is a good example of how up in the air the structures of the church were, right? That if you didn't like the answer from the bishop of your town, you know, go to the town across the river, or, you know, over in the next country, and maybe you'll get an answer that you like better, right? Because there is no established hierarchy. So what happens is Bishop Alexander then complains to Constantine. He complains to the emperor, and he says, here's this guy who refuses to accept my authority theologically, to tell him that he's wrong about this substance of Jesus question, and he goes off and he gets ordained by these other bishops, and they don't respect my authority, and you, the emperor, need to do something about this because it's disorderly, right? This is not the way to run a railroad. Well, meanwhile, Arius has one of his bishop friends, Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, write on his behalf, you know, in his defense, and say, no, what this guy is writing really makes sense. He's a student of Origen, you know, he's really a good guy. And so Constantine is right back where he was with the Donatists, right? It's like, this is not my fight. I don't care. This is a stupid question. And we actually have some of his letters back to these people saying, would you guys get your act together? You know, figure this out. Come on. Eventually, Constantine sends like a messenger to say to both parties, you know, you need to work this out or I'm going to be seriously unhappy. And that guy comes back and he says, I think the only thing that's going to work is you're going to have another council of the bishops. You know, that's the only way this is ever going to get resolved. And so that's what they do. They start setting up this council that ultimately meets in Nicaea. And it's supposed to be a council of bishops. So you get Alexander and you get Eusebius, but basically they've got Athanasius on the one hand and Arius on the other hand, sort of being their law clerks, you know, preparing briefs for them and kind of talking in their ear as they're having this argument with all the other bishops and in front of the emperor. Ultimately, it's interesting what happens, and then we'll finish for today, that the council comes down on the side of their fellow bishop. Well, of course they do, which is to say Alexander, and say, you know, yes, you should have the authority. And if you have told this guy that this is heresy, then he should shut up and he should go into exile. And, you know, we're going to create a document that basically says you're right. And we'll look at that in a second. But the next thing that happens is after Constantine dies, his successor is actually an Arian. And that's why we need to know this term, because for the next 1,500, 1,600 years, anybody who agrees with the proposition that Jesus is not God is going to be called an Arian. That's going to be the term of our that refers to someone who would have been on Arius's side in this controversy. And there will always be Arians. There will always be people who take that position, who hold that heresy, and we are their descendants. We are what it ultimately came to be an Arian. That part of that's going to be geographical. Part of it's going to be who was your missionary. So as the Roman Empire begins to send out missionaries, especially into the West, like into the Germanic tribes and into the Franks and the Goths and those people, some of those missionaries are going to be Arians. And so they're spreading a kind of Christianity that will not be precisely congruent with what the bishops and the authorities in Rome have decided is the right answer. So the issue is never going to totally go away. It's always going to be alive throughout the history of the church. And it's going to come back immediately because Constantine's successors are Arians. And so they're going to say, you know what, actually, we never mind that council. We think Arius was right. And then a couple emperors later, they're going to say, no, we think the bishops were right, because they're going to get grief from the bishops, right, because for not agreeing with them. So it's going to go back and forth a couple more times before the doctrine gets solidified. Yeah, Peggy.
That's Arian, A-R-I-A-N, right?
Right. No Y.
Right.
Arian with a Y is a completely different thing.
Right.
Okay. So if you have that in front of you, Peggy, why don't you just read the creed that comes out of Nicaea at the bottom of the page. This is the group statement that they agreed to before they all left and went back home.
I should have this memorized because we used to say this.
It'll sound familiar to some people.
Absolutely. Yeah? We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, the only begotten, that is of the essence of the Father, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance.
That's that word homoousios, and it's going to come back up again. That's the Greek term.
Being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made, both in heaven and on earth, who of us men and for our salvation came down and was incarnate and was made man. He suffered, and the third day he rose again, ascended into heaven. From thence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead, and in the Holy Ghost. But those who say there was a time when he was not, and he was not before he was made, and he was made out of nothing, or he is of another substance or essence, or the Son of God is created, or changeable, or alterable, they are condemned by the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church.
Okay.
They covered everything. They had it's like a legal document. Like,
Right. They were leaving you no room for wiggle room. Yeah, right. But
wow.
you know, churches do use this statement liturgically, and it's like, what are they talking about? If you don't know the history of this council and what they were arguing about, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But once you understand that argument, every line in here is like boom, 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 boom. They are setting up the markers of what is going to constitute orthodoxy and what is going to constitute heresy. And that's kind of the first time that happens in that overarching collective way. So you can kind of see a parallel between the local persecutions of Christians, and then when it finally becomes under Diocletian an empire-wide, everybody's in on it kind of thing, and the way in which heresy and orthodoxy evolved with different bishops here and there making different rulings on various different questions that come up, and then finally this kind of collective decision under the auspices of the emperor saying, no, we are going to have a standard, we're going to have boundaries, and this is what they're going to look like. And out of that is, in addition to this, settling this question, the other thing that they did was to identify those 5 bishops from Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, as if we have to do this again, you 5, you're the ones. You know, if you 5 agree, that's it. That's the end of the argument. So you begin to get this hierarchy of who gets to decide in some sort of orderly way, rather than every believer for himself about what you think Paul was talking about, or what you think Origen was talking about, or what you think John's gospel was talking about. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, well, we're kind of at the end of our time. So next week, we'll get into a little bit more about what happens after the end of the Roman Empire in the West, and how Christianity becomes something other than a Roman state religion, but hangs on to power. Okay.
Okay.
All right. See y'all next week.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.